This is Dan Schneider on This Dan Schneider. The subject is polygamy. Evolutionary biologist Joe Henrich is here to speak with me about it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Joe Henrich is my guest. We are going to be speaking about polygamy. I'd like to give him a couple of minutes to give a little bit of background about himself, what has drawn him to take on the topic, and his views on it. So, Joe, if you could give a little background about yourself.
Sure. So I'm a professor at the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. I've previously been a faculty member at the University of British Columbia in both psychology and economics, and my PhD is in anthropology, cultural anthropology. So I travel around the social sciences, and generally my research is on cultural evolution and something called gene-culture coevolution. So that's the idea that much of human genetic evolution has been driven by cultural evolution, the fact that we can learn from each other, and we have this second system of inheritance, of informational inheritance. I got interested in marriage systems in general, and polygamy specifically, just in trying to understand life in small-scale societies, and then actually got pulled into the question of polygamy when I got a call from the lead counsel for the Attorney General of British Columbia, and they were asking a constitutional question to the Supreme Court of British Columbia. And so he was aware of some of my background and thought that I might be a good expert witness. So things kind of went from there.
So just as here, as we record in 2017, gay marriage has been legal for a year or so, having gone through the Supreme Court of the U.S. This was a similar thing, were polygamists trying to get polygamy legalized in British Columbia at the time?
No, it's quite different. So in southern British Columbia, there's a community called Bountiful, and these are women fundamentalists. They're associated with the Warren Jeffs group in the U.S. And the Attorney General wanted to prosecute one of the Bountiful leaders on polygamy charges, but he wasn't sure if the polygamy statutes in British Columbia would withstand constitutional challenge. So in Canada, unlike in the U.S. system, you can just ask a question to the Supreme Court. You don't have to do everything through trial, basically.
Well, let me, before I get into specifically things I've read about your opinions on it, why do you think that polygamy, as we record here in the early 21st century, still seems to be taboo when gay marriage, if you just went back 20 or 30 years ago, seemed to be much, much farther away from being legalized than polygamy was? Does this have to do with Christian attitudes towards Judaism or Islam? Is it just plain the idea that it's somehow sexist? Since it seems to have been much more historically widespread than homosexual unions were.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, there's no intellectual connection between gay marriage and polygyny in terms of social policy. So the arguments by which you'd want to be skeptical about allowing polygamous marriage actually tell the opposite story with gay marriage. So I'm never quite sure why people try to put those two things in the same bucket.
Well, just so people know, polygyny and polygamy are different things. Polygamy is actual marriage of a person, or multiple marriage, if you will, whereas polygyny is just sort of groups hanging together, reproducing, etc. I guess most tribal systems would be considered polygynous then.
So I think the way to think about it is polygamy is the cover term for marriage systems, thinking about humans, and polygyny is when one man can have multiple wives. Polyandry is when one woman can have multiple husbands. Okay. There's a combination of those two, and but they both have to do with, we're talking about marriage systems, right? So yeah, not sex, right?
Yeah. So let me get to the stuff I've read on your work. It seems to me that from what I've seen, you have a more pragmatic view of this. You've done, and other people with you have done research that it seems to indicate that polygynous societies are more violent. And from what I could gather, the reason, or the presumed reason, is that the evolutionary losers in this scenario, i.e. the men that don't get all the women, get antsy and anxious and rebellious, and this causes a lot of social problems. Is that correct? And if you could expand a bit.
That's one piece of the argument. So, I mean, the question the intellectual question that I asked wasn't actually the public policy question. I wanted to understand why, given that what we know from the anthropological database and the historical database, something like 85% of human societies have allowed men to take multiple wives, so they've been polygynous. And but then, with the rise of Europe and stuff, monogamous marriage spread all over the world and became law. So it actually gets to much of the world relatively late. So, for example, Japan adopts the laws for monogamy in the Meiji Restoration, so late 19th century. China does in the 1950s, Nepal 1963, Turkey in the 20th century. See, there's all these, relatively late historic adoptions of laws prohibiting polygamy. So the question is why, and why did monogamy spread? And the case that we make in our paper on this, and I've subsequently made elsewhere, is that monogamy does a bunch of things that make those societies more competitive in competition against other societies. And you put your finger on what I think of as the key one, or the main one, which is that in polygynous societies, so if you imagine you have the poorest, lowest status guys down here, the high status guys up here, and you line up the women will migrate and become wives of the richest, most powerful guys in the society. And that'll create a pool of low-status unmarried males that, in order to even get into the mating and marriage pool, they have to dramatically increase their status. So they begin taking risks and making decisions that have some chance of a big payoff that would allow them to get into the higher status. And that leads to violence, crime, social disharmony, a bunch of other things, some abuses. But when you have monogamy, the average guy or even low status guys have a chance of getting a wife, of having children, and this has a big effect on male psychology. So we know in Western societies, when you get married, your testosterone drops. When you have a child, it drops again. Whereas in polygynous societies, there's no drop. And there's very little childcare in polygynous societies, so you don't have a drop due to the children. So it has a direct biological effect on males, the marriage system.
It's interesting you talked about male psychology, because I would think that two cases could be made for why polygamy and the evolutionary losers that don't get wives might benefit. The first would be that you always hear the old saw about men being like the bee and the women being the flower, and it would seem to me that if there are a lot of dukes and earls that have multiple wives, and I'm a lowly peasant that works in the field, but I'm being eyed by one of the less favored wives, I could then maybe get with her, father a child, get my seed into her, but have none of the responsibilities that we have. I would think, number one, that would seem advantageous. So that's my first claim. Let me just address that to you, and then I'll get to number two.
Yeah, sure. Well, so that logic may in fact play itself out, because what you find in polygynous societies is husbands, fathers, and brothers go to extreme efforts to protect and constrain the women. So this is the origin of harems. This is the origin of dressing the woman in head-to-toe clothing. This is the origin of all kinds of constraints on women, keeping them in the house because they're trying to keep from that guy in the field from having a shot. So it actually leads to a strengthening of the control of women, increased gender inequality, and other related downstream effects.
So unless basically you're Sir Lancelot, who's favored by the king in some other way, you don't have a chance of getting the Guinevere.
Yeah, I guess that's...
and my second one would be if monogamy solves some of these issues that polygamy brings up, why would not polyandry being legalized be an answer? Because, again, I think we'll go back to the psychology. Is it just that men don't want to be sharing their bed with a woman even if she's not hers? I mean, we have this whole, sort of penthouse Bob Guccione thing where men seem to not like homosexuality unless it's two gorgeous lesbians. Is it the same thing that men don't want to be in this, don't want to be husband number three? Is it the male ego thing?
Well, yeah. I mean, psychologically and cross-culturally, you see very little polyandry. Mm-hmm. So maybe 1% of known human societies have polyandrous marriage. Those societies also have polygynous marriage. In the societies where it's common, the males are typically brothers. And the reason for this is straightforward from an evolutionary biology perspective, is that males have conflict. They'll have sexual jealousy and conflict if they share the same wife. And they also have, they're less certain about their paternity. So the wife has children, well, who's the father? Well, you're not quite sure.
Yeah.
And the more fathers you have, the less certainty you have. And then there's a cooperative dilemma. Okay, who's going to do the fatherly investment? Well, I think it was probably you. Well, I think it was you. And so this creates intra-household conflict between males. And males are much more inclined to violence across societies. It's men do 90% of the crimes, 90% of the violence, or 90% of the prisoners. They're the ones you got to manage, not the women.
And is this strictly a simian thing? Because, again, I'm not an expert on mammalian behavior or whatnot, but I know that there are certain other mammalian species wherein there are extended families and the males act more lovingly towards the whole group, offspring of the next generation. Is this something that comes to the human beings from our simian chimpanzee kind of warrior past? I mean, where does this come from? Do we know?
Well, so all the apes all the great apes are polygynous, meaning they have multiple matings. So humans are interesting because we have pair bonding, so we do form these long-term relationships with one another. Gorillas do that, chimpanzees don't. But there's nothing in the kind of ape lineage that would suggest we can have, large groups with men and women that could be organized in these other ways. So male chimpanzees, male gorillas do no child care. So we're kind of unique in that area.
But there are hierarchies. For example, there is the top silverback. There is the king of the Kongs. There in the chimpanzees. There are always, I've seen enough documentaries going back to Wild Kingdom 40 years ago to know that. What do you think it is that separates human beings from their great ape forebears in this particular manner? Is it just the consequence that we are more psychologically advanced, so we think of crazier ideas of being cuckolded, say?
Oh, I want to make sure I understand your question. I mean, the gorillas are actually somewhat similar to the kind of logic I'm laying out. So in gorilla groups, you have one male silverback gorilla that controls a harem, they call it a harem, of female gorillas. And then there's bachelor males that kind of patrol the perimeter of his area and try to secretly mate with the female gorillas in his group, and he has to go ape in order to keep them away.
Go ahead.
So that seems like some of the things we see cross-culturally, where there's a lot of concern about defending the wives and women.
Well, let me turn towards more modern concepts about it. There's an odd kind of political marriage between modern-day feminists here in the West and sort of Christian cultural conservatives, in that both of them condemn polygamy for pretty much the same reasons, saying that it's misogynistic, that it's this, that, or the other thing. What research has been done, and do you agree with the idea that somehow we are dealing with more internal violence within the unit, i.e. that there is the patriarch, there's this image of out in the great American desert, there's Jebediah who has his, half a dozen 15, 16-year-old wives, and he's sexually molesting these children and whatnot. Is there any truth to that, or is that generally overhyped?
Well, the thing for which we have the best data on is the effect of polygyny on the mortality of children. And, using very detailed households where you can actually compare children raised in a household that was monogamous and then another wife came in as polygynous. You're more likely to die if you're born into and grow up in a polygynous household compared to a monogamous household. And so there's a large number of studies showing the effects of polygyny on child mortality. And the idea, there's a few things going on. One is you have competition among co-wives. So, if you think about a polygynous household, you have wives that are often unrelated genetically, have children, and will all share the same resource base. So those women are basically trying to take care of their children, and they're competing directly with non-relatives within the same household. So that's thought to create conflict, and there's other studies that show that not being genetically related but competing over the same resources in the household leads to violence. So, for example, in the U.S., having unrelated children in the household is likely to lead to abuse. It increases the probability of abuse. When parents are unrelated to their genetic children, not in the case of adopted children, but in other situations, you're more likely to die an accidental death in those situations.
Well, let me just ask.
There does seem to be some evidence that there's more violence in these households. One of the big things, or one of several factors, is that in polygynous societies, and this is true of polygynous in the U.S. and Canada, is you have a large age gap between husbands and wives. And even if you look at purely monogamous societies, say within the U.S., when there's a big age gap between husbands and wives, they're more likely to kill each other. So if you just look at homicide data.
Well, you brought up an interesting point about adopted versus natural kids. For example, I was adopted into my family, and the people that had given me up for adoption got back together after I was adopted. They married. They had their own biological son, my full brother, and then they adopted a child. And I'm wondering, have studies ever been done for that sort of different strokes kind of thing? And the child they adopted happened to be black as well. That would seem to me to be an interesting contrast to what you were talking about. When we look at adopted families and we have a biological child and a non-biological child, do we see the same patterns that you just described with?
Yeah. So here's how it breaks down. So you have your baseline genetic child with two parents, and if you have an adopted child with two parents, the adopted child does just as well as the genetic child. But the key point you just made is that if you then bring genetic children of those same parents, so you have a direct competition between an adopted child and a genetic child, the adopted child starts to lose. They get taken to the dentist less frequently, they get less education, all that kind of stuff. So it's when you create that competition within the household that the issues arise.
Well, this seems to me then to be less an argument against polygamy or polygyny rather than it is an argument for the overwhelming bias that we still have for the family, the clan, the tribe. Isn't this more or less sort of like a big neon sign that human beings are just sort of, even in the 21st century, just tribal to their core?
Well, there's a lot of stuff packed into what you just said, but it's certainly true that I would advocate that in doing public policy, we need to take account of the fact that we're products of evolution, that being genetically related actually means something, and that we have a psychology that takes that into account, which is why you get these effects. But that then plays into, okay, then let's look at polygynous households versus monogamous households. A monogamous household has the maximum genetic relatedness you can create. As soon as you have a polygynous household, you're bringing unrelated women together, and then you're reducing the overall genetic relatedness among people. And the most important factor is genetically unrelated children and adults. And that's when you're most likely to get a lack of supervision and actually violence within the household.
One of the human tendencies that we have is, especially when we have biases, even if justified, against something, we tend to look at things monolithically. What studies, if any, have been done about various types of polygyny or polygamy, i.e., the Mormons here in the West, Islamic people maybe who are herders up in Siberia or Mongolia, those in Polynesia? Are there differing shades? Do we see the same polygamous things play out, or does being Islamic matter more or less than, say, if you're from Polynesia or off in Utah?
Yeah. So well, the sort of general answer to that question is there's lots of interesting variation. So just to give you some examples, throughout the Americas, polygamy was typically sororal polygyny, which meant you could get more than one wife, but those wives are supposed to be sisters. And that can make a big difference, because one is it limits the amount of polygyny you can have if everyone has to be sisters, because there's only so many sisters. And but it also means that the wives are related, which means they have a genetic relatedness that reduces that problem I just described. And Islam is a little bit different in the sense that there is the rule of a maximum of 4 wives. And the religious teachings are clear that those wives are supposed to be treated equally. So you can't let what happens in some societies is that some wives become second-class citizens, or at least that's, no doubt that happens to some degree, but at least there's a sort of religious push against that. Now the Mormons are a great case, because it's kind of like a natural experiment. They try out polygyny around 1840, 1850. It goes on for a couple of decades, and then the U.S. military cracks down and puts an end to it by 1890. That's the end. So, except for these, except for the ones that have continued in some of the remote areas. So, and we see the exact same pattern happen there, and it's amazing that you see the same social dynamics. So, the first thing that happened we have some detailed empirical data here, and the age at which women get married starts dropping. It starts dropping for both polygynously married women and monogamously married women. So the distance between husbands and their wives is increasing. Household relatedness is going down. So some of the same patterns emerge. And then if you fast forward and you look at some people who have left the modern communities, you'll see the same stories, like this story of the lost boy phenomenon, where the societies, because there's polygyny, they're generating this group of males who are never going to marry. And they're just sort of pushed out into the larger society. There's often lots of social problems generated by the lost boys. It's very tragic.
And by lost boys, just so people know, we're talking about like in Africa where these kids become 12, 13-year-old soldiers, right? That kind of thing?
No. So I'm thinking here of young men in, say, Utah.
Oh, okay.
Or the Arizona-Utah border.
Okay, so, I remember with Darfur the term lost boy was used. I thought that's what you were referring to. Sorry.
Yeah, so polygynous Mormon communities will put out these young men who are never going to marry and sort of get driven out of town. Okay. So there's some interesting anthropology on these cases. And that's this extra group of low-status males that I talk about in the theory part. So there's a bunch of similar social dynamics. So the key things are, once you institute polygyny, you get this low-status group of males, you get a big difference between the ages of husbands and wives, you get households with unrelated unrelated adult children pairs. And then the interesting thing that you see amongst Mormons are things like daughter and sister exchange. So if you were to read about polygynous societies in Africa, one of the practices that's always striking for my students is that brothers or fathers will exchange their daughters or sisters with other men in other communities, daughter for daughter or sister for sister. And that sounds like a very strange practice to us, except 20th century Mormon polygynists have that practice. They do daughter exchange essentially amongst the very polygynous males. So that's a social custom that seems very strange, but cropped up, within an American tradition.
Let me just ask then about the role religion plays in this. Have there ever been any, say, atheistic or agnostic, non-religious polygamous unions? For example, did communist societies, was there polygamy there that was sanctioned?
I've never run across anything in communist societies.
No.
Yeah.
Let me ask about the economic angle then. One of the things that's, one of the biggest causes of war generally that people will talk about, especially in modern societies post-agricultural revolution, is, that the inequality of societies, the inequality within societies. Is polygamy within Western societies, more advanced economically societies that are more equitable? Are the rates lower? Could you envision, say, if we get to a point, people who believe like in the robo-apocalypse and then say, well, machines will do everything, everyone will have a guaranteed income. Do you think that that kind of a society would be more welcoming to polygamy because we wouldn't have the outre losers out there because everyone would be more equal on an economic standing? What role does the economy play?
Yeah, right. Well, so it's interesting. I was just writing about this very early convict who escapes into Central Australia when the British were using Australia for their penal colonies, and he ends up, it's his story, William Buckley, and he ends up living amongst these groups, and they're all economically very similar. There's not any economic difference between males. Food is widely shared. But the thing the men compete over is women, and some men have 5 or 6 wives, some men have 0. And this generates raiding amongst communities because the guys with 0 figure, they can get together and go to the next community and raid for young women. So even in a place like egalitarian hunter-gatherers, the distribution of women created inequity, which drove violence. So if you think about it, another way to think about monogamy is it's essentially egalitarian. It's communism, right? It's an egalitarian program where we're going to try to redistribute women from the rich down the social scale.
Yeah. Well, let me just then ask about the legal aspects of this rather than the economic or the ethical. Given the United States Constitution, is do you see that if, let's say, there were a legal challenge brought to it, I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but I don't see how anyone could legally say that's not, even if we could prove, say, that it's detrimental. We know that cancer kills, but we're not going to go back to prohibition of alcohol or cigarettes. You know, even if we know that polygyny or polygamy is not socially redeeming or whatever you want to call it, is there really a case to outlaw it?
Well, this was the constitutional question that was asked in Canada, and the Canadian Charter has basically the same. It's the same, fundamentally the same rights as you would find in the U.S. Bill of Rights. Freedom of religion, freedom of association are the key issues. So polygyny would seem to violate both of those, and so the only way you can legally make a case. Obviously you're impinging on people's religion if the religion says be polygynous, or freedom of association, is if it's a public ban. So is if this is creating ills of society, it's creating problems of society, and there's no way to solve it with a low-level law. So the counter-argument would be, oh, okay, so polygyny is creating violence against women and girls, let's make a law against violence for women and girls. Oh, we already have a law against that. So then you shouldn't make it illegal. The thing that polygyny does is that argument you described at first, where you have that excess pool of young males. There's no way to solve that at a lower level. So unlike things like violence against girls, which is a bad legal argument, I'm not a lawyer, but just working through the logic, it would seem to me to be a bad legal argument because you can solve it with a lower level law. But the reallocation problem, there's no way to go lower with that.
Canada seems to have a little bit extra legalisms, I guess you call it, than the U.S. does in that, for example, they give far more sovereignty to what they call First Nations, or what we would call Native Americans, American Indians. And I'm wondering, for example, I know here, even in the U.S., casinos are legal on Indian reservations because they are given de facto legal rights. They have their own police systems, most of the larger tribes. In Canada, for example, though, if, say, what we call the Eskimos or the Inuit or the Chippewas or whatnot, if there were a culture that had their own polygyny, culturally ingrained in them, it would seem that in Canada it would be almost impossible to deny them that right, because that would be sort of cultural genocide, they would call it, or something. Whereas in the U.S. it would seem far easier for us to impose, the larger society's will upon them. Have you ever researched that? Do you know of that since you were involved in this case?
Yeah, that did come up in this case, interestingly enough. I mean, the thing is, there's lots of practices that are indigenous practices that are outlawed. So it's not like Canadian government or the U.S. government has been shy about outlawing indigenous practices. So one place where this did come up was immigrants. So if you have immigrants from polygynous countries, they might actually already have multiple wives, and shouldn't they be allowed to practice their home, the practices from their home country? And so France tried this. So France tried allowing migrants from Africa to continue to practice polygyny once they got to Paris or wherever they were moving to. And, it was a complete disaster. And eventually the French said, okay, we're not doing that anymore. Because it led to men coming to France, getting wealthy, and then using that to bring in additional wives from Africa.
Let me talk then, because I was just looking up. One tradition that seems to have an odd relation to polygamy and polygyny is Buddhism. And Buddhism sort of sits on the fence between being a philosophy and a religion. What do you know, for example, about Tibet, Bhutan, all of those Himalayan societies? Because I have seen, for example, some documentaries where there seems to be some of that in there. And so do you know anything about how they view the practice?
Well, I'm not sure about how it interfaces with Buddhism, but the populations in there are known for being both polygynous and also polyandrous. So that's the part of the world where we find polyandry. And even some amount of polygyny, which is, so you'll have the following situation. You have say 3 brothers, they marry the same woman, so it's polyandry. Then the youngest brother marries monogamously or polygynously, and then so you have both things going on. So you can have polyandry and polygyny intermixed within the same compounds.
Let us talk for a moment about polyandry, because that's probably mentioned 1/100th, if that the amount of time that polygamy or polygyny comes up. What do we see? Do we see divergent cultural, I don't know, negatives in the fewer polyandry societies or cultures that there are, or do we find anything particularly, a nugget of something odd that stands out? Are they mirrors of each other, or what?
No. I mean, that's the thing. They're not mirrors at all. I mean, a standard answer as to why some societies are polyandrous is that you need multiple men to make the household economics work. So if one person has to do a lot of distant traveling and another person has to take care of the farm, then where 2 brothers working together can make that work. There's lots of societies, for example, in the Americas, where you maintain a very low frequency of polyandrous marriage. They're often short duration, but you will have periods where people are just kind of loose about how many partners or how many different spouses you can have. So there'll be periods where a few people will have 2, 3 men with 1 wife, but maybe last 5 years or 10 years or something like that, and then people move on. Yeah, that's amazingly common, and I think underreported as best I can tell in the anthropological work.
We have not spoken about the genetic component to this. One of the biggest taboos, I think, worldwide is generally incest, and I guess most people would ascribe that to, well, we know that if we inbreed too much, we're going to have, an extra digit here, we're going to have cross-eyed there, the people are going to be sick all the time. Look at the tribes of Europe and the inbreeding in royal families. Do we have any idea? For example, Iceland is a good example too, since they're quite isolated. They've always tried to spread their genes out as much as they could. Do we know, for example, that there are higher incidences of genetic malformations, genetic diseases within polygynous societies, and is that a good argument against it as well?
No, I haven't seen anything like that because there's not necessarily any higher rates of inbreeding in polygynous societies.
No, but I mean, even if we have like the thing we were talking about, brothers sharing a wife or whatnot, and is that my brother is also my 3rd cousin once removed kind of thing?
Yeah, that's pretty common. I mean, some degree of interconnections is common because people marry cousins a lot. That cousin marriage is very common. But there's nothing about polygyny per se which creates that. So that's a fact about how complex kinship systems work. I haven't seen any reason to believe that polygyny as a specific practice is what's creating that extra relatedness. Now, one thing that is relevant is that men accumulate mutations as they get older. And so in polygynous societies, fathers tend to be older, and so they're going to have more mutations. So there's an extra kind of mutational load created by anything that makes the father older. Now, polygyny is one thing, but of course lots of other things can make fathers older as well.
Well, that's also true, like men that reproduce, have a 3rd family. They marry their 3rd wife when they're 60 and she's 20 years older. She wants her kid. The kid tends to, because I guess sperm weakens or gets whatever right. term we want.
Right.
Let me just
add.
The
current U.S. president would be an example of someone with income.
Yeah. Let me ask about how the views have changed. 150 or so years ago, yeah, we were against Brigham Young and all those lousy Mormons and whatnot. But it seemed to me that it was more about what we thought of as a society the Bible said, rather than any negatives against the individuals. Do we know, for example, let's just keep it here in the U.S. or North America, do we know, are there higher incidences of sexual abuse? I think so, rape, incest, sexual violence within? I mean, do we have that stereotype of the old guy who looks like he's from an Anabaptist school, and his, you know, he's touching little girls? Is that part of the revulsion, and is there, you know, statistical proof to back that up?
I've never encountered any data anything that looks like data on that front.
No, so I mean, then when people talk, have that stereotype where we're projecting something onto these people, then that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where it will be tough to get data, right? I mean, so I've read a bunch of these books, like I was mentioning, The Lost Boy.
Yeah.
And that's the story about the Warren Jeffs community.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of child abuse going on in that community.
Yeah.
So there were these high-profile cases where there seems to have been a lot of abuse of children. But to know whether that's a real fact statistically, we'd have to be getting a lot of reports from children. Now, people may have that data, and it may not have crossed my path. But I would be very interested in seeing good data on that.
Do you know worldwide is, for example, polygamy or polygyny tolerated far more in the Muslim world still, or you said, you know, there's a prohibition against more than 4 wives, but if you have 2 or 3, is it okay? And do most Muslim men seek to get that, you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's certainly the case that, you know, if you go to the Sultan of Brunei,
yeah,
maintains a harem. The Saudi guys, they have multiple wives. The leader of North Korea has a pleasure troop devoted to him. Yes, but it certainly seems plausible that the kind of professionals that live in cities in the Middle East may have a different view on this, and might have adopted the broader, the monogamous practices. I'm not sure about that. That's a good. I should look around for survey data for that. I don't know the answer.
How about? Well, let's just because we'll get.
Certainly in Africa, it's still a high status thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, President of South Africa made a big deal about how polygamous he was. Same thing with other African leaders.
We mean sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, sub-Saharan.
And do we, for example, in those societies where there are that are mostly Islam, like in Central Africa, are the Christians allowed, or if there are any Jews, or is it only Muslims that are allowed to practice that?
Well, there's still lots of polygamy. It happens, we did an analysis recently, and an economist named James Spensky also did an analysis. But if you take the historical locations of Christian missions, the closer you live to those Christian missions, which don't exist now but did, the less polygyny you do. So it looks like, the sort of more Christianized, and the longer you've been Christianized, the lower your polygyny rates.
Now, the argument then, if that's so, to be made was that, I guess, that's sort of the white man's burden kind of thing, that we're civilizing the savages, saving those poor African girls from these terrible men that are out to abuse them. Because that's the kind of argument that sometimes is made, whether we're talking about First Nations in Canada or whatnot, is that we are culturally imposing the Western values upon these other people. Do you think that has an ethical foot to stand on?
No, I don't think the way to do development or to proceed is to impose things on people. I do think it's okay to promote the free flow of ideas, and people can adopt as they like.
Mm-hmm. Let me just as we sort of wrap this up, I want to just get a little bit more speculative. Do you think that polygyny as a whole is sort of on the way out? People have made the argument, for example, that they think in a few hundred years, as technology increases and as things democratize, and that even in the farthest corners of the planet, people get technology, they get cell phones, they get this and that, as we become a global culture. Do you think polygyny is doomed socially, if not legally?
I'm not sure. So, polygyny feeds on inequality, right? So because it's this difference among men. So imagine. So you mentioned this before, but if you flatten men out, there's a lot less differences for women to sort on. But if you allow men to go from zero wealth to billions, then there's a big incentive to being the third or fourth wife of the billionaire as opposed to being the first wife of the poor guy.
Yeah.
So you create more incentives for polygyny to crop up, and women would support it too. So there's this assumption that polygamy is a male thing, but it's a constraint on women's choices.
Yeah.
It's saying you can't be the second wife of the billionaire, you can only be the first wife of the middle-class guy.
Yeah.
So people don't often realize the degree to which polygamy is a constraint on female choice. And that's fundamentally what it is.
Yeah, and that's a similar argument a lot of, I guess, small f feminist women would make against the big F feminist women, is that you can't tell me I can't act in a porno film if I want to be a porno star or whatnot. But you mentioned earlier that it seems to be the males that drive this. If we look ahead, it seems almost inevitable if we don't wipe ourselves out that, as we spread out amongst the stars, as we eventually most likely get artificial intelligence, that the most human kind of androids that first popped up are probably going to be things like Sexpots. So, I mean, I know this seems silly, but I'm just trying to extend what we know about the human past into the future. If every guy in the future can afford to have his Scarlett Johansson look-alike Sexpot, or his Angelina Jolie Sexpot, or Halle Berry Sexpot, it would seem to me that whether I'm a Muslim or a sheep herder in Nepal or whatnot, that tendency is going to go away. We'd only need the human females for breeding purposes. So I guess in the larger sense, I'm saying marriage itself might be doomed, polygamous or monogamous. Any ideas?
We really seem to be at a nexus point in terms of to changing society. It's possible that marriage will go away. So it may all become irrelevant.
Well, let me just end then with your ideas. Are you working on any books or any studies yourselves on polygamy or on any things related to it?
Yeah, well, my main project right now is a book. It's called Weird People, where weird is an acronym. It stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And what I found is that Westerners are psychologically unusual in a bunch of different ways. And so the book is a kind of historical narrative about how Westerners became so psychologically unusual. And this relates to the rise of the West, economic prosperity, and stuff like that. But one of the key things that happened in the West was this imposition of monogamous marriage by the Catholic Church. So, all of Europe is polygynous, and then Catholic Christianity begins to force people to be monogamous and have small families and stuff. And I see that as the takeoff point for a bunch of stuff.
That sounds a lot like, or it seems to cover some of the same ground that Jared Diamond has covered on. I'm just wondering if you're ready for any backlash on that, because when you talk about those kinds of things, inevitably you get called an imperialist or this or that.
Well, I don't know. Just trying to figure stuff out.
Okay.
So I know Jared Diamond's work well. So you're thinking of Guns, Germs, and Steel?
Yeah, that kind of thing. You get the idea that, well, people would talk. He thinks geography, makes destiny, that kind of thing. The idea of European exceptionalism, the noble savage. We're not talking that kind of area, are we?
Well, I think Jared's idea works great until about 1500. But then I think there's quite a bit of agreement that to explain the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent expansion of the West, something else, some additional ideas are needed. And so this is about, about some of the institutions and cultural evolution that would have shaped modern psychology and economic production and whatnot.
Well, let me just end by asking you on your own personal opinion and your legal opinion about polygamy. If you were, for example, ever called to testify in a Supreme Court case, would you want to do that? Would you want to be called? Just right out there, would you, if you had the choice to legalize it or not, would you legalize it even despite what seemed to be your reservations?
Well, I think that's really not what I have to offer. In my various papers and writings and stuff, I lay out the case for how monogamy works, the kind of social dynamics and polygyny, and make a case for why it spread, why it did spread. I'm way out of my depth if I try to offer legal opinions.
Okay. Well, I will link to your page at Harvard, and I want to thank you for spending some time to talk to me about an interesting subject. Hopefully, maybe in the future we can talk a bit more about some of your other work in another show.
Okay, great.